In October 2014, at the top of the Thorong La Pass at 5,000 meters on the Annapurna circuit, a small cabin was full of climbers and hikers huddled together, trying to escape the once-in-a-generation snowstorm outside. They sat on top of each other. There was no space, and everyone inside was showing signs of hypothermia. During their 20-hour wait, some climbers could not bear the lack of personal space, so they decided to take their chances after paying porters inside the tea house to take them down the trail. But none would survive. Days later, as others left, they walked through 5 feet of snow. There was no path besides the bodies and bags that lay before them every few hundred feet. Bodies of friends, bodies of guides. They stopped counting after 10, but they seemed endless. What these climbers would experience was one of Nepal's deadliest storms. This is their story. The Annapurna circuit is a 160 to 230 kilometer hike, depending on your route. Day 1 starts at 1,300 meters in Kathmandu, the largest town in the area. The trek usually lasts between 12 to 22 days, depending on how many detours a group wants to take. Climbers and hikers make a circle around 5 towering peaks in the Himalayas, with the tallest being Annapurna 1, an 8,091 meter mountain nicknamed the Killer Mountain for its difficulty to climb. Many trips on the circuit are different from one another, as it takes some longer to acclimatize to the highest altitude at 5,400 meters. There are also shortcuts along the route that climbers can take to shorten the trip. While a long trek with significant variations in altitude, it is still considered to be an entry-level hike, as the start of the trip has many dirt roads and traffic. While a certain level of fitness is required, as there are definitely challenging points, for the most part, climbers and hikers get to go at their own pace, taking breaks as needed. Most individuals spend 5 to 7 hours per day trekking, and most nights by a fire, enjoying the outdoors and once-in-a-lifetime scenery. Additionally, most people hire porters to carry their supplies, which removes some of the burden. I know that is a controversial point in mountaineering, but we won't get into that here. Climbers can choose between summer and winter, with the winter obviously posing more risks. However, to many, it is by far the better option, as the landscape views are unparalleled. But it is colder, much colder. The average daily temperature on the circuit during the winter is 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, but the higher the altitude, the colder it gets, with some areas reporting as low as negative 20 degrees Celsius at its peak. Remember, this is during the day, so nights only get colder. Besides the freezing temperatures, there are a number of other risks on the circuit, such as altitude sickness, terrain issues, falls, and of course, the unpredictable weather of the Himalayas. This mainly comes into play each year, because it is not uncommon for many hikers to get lost at some point on the trail. Nepal has 750,000 tourists visiting the country annually, and over 20,000 of them are there for the circuit. There are over 1,000 registered trekking agencies, and with that many people on the circuit each year, the odds that something will go wrong at some point are high. That is why a general level of fitness and training is essential for the multi-week trek. In April 2014, Mount Everest experienced one of the worst tragedies ever seen on its peak. The most dangerous part of the mountain, the Khumbu Icefall, had a giant serac collapse, causing an avalanche that killed 16 Sherpas. I have an entire video on this topic, so check it out after this one. After this accident, the mountaineering world was shook, but that was not the only tragedy that would occur that year. The winter season started normally. It was colder than usual, but in early October, there were no ominous signs or concerns, as thousands began the multi-week trek from Kathmandu. But on October 6th, a cyclone began forming over the Andaman Sea, southeast of the Himalayas. 2 days later, on October 8th, it was officially classified as a cyclone storm named Hudhud.
Cyclone Hudhud.
Cyclone Hudhud. Hudhud.
Cyclone Hudhud.
Cyclone Hudhud.
Cyclone Hudhud is gaining speed. The latest forecast is for landfall tomorrow. It's been scaled up from 170 to 180 kilometers per hour, with winds gusting now up to 195 kilometers per hour.
The following day on October 9th, as more hikers started their treks, the storm was upgraded to a severe cyclonic storm. While Nepal has an early warning weather system, it is nothing like the Western world, and still, it's developing today. Stephen Fabes, an outdoor enthusiast from the UK, left the small town of Basisahar with his partner, American Mike Roy, on their bikes, utterly unaware of the cyclone barreling their way on October 9th. They both wanted to complete the circuit, and had only met a month prior in India, but after hitting it off, they decided to complete the trek together. As Hudhud was upgraded to severe cyclonic storm with sea winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, the duo experienced a very different reality. The weather was perfect for them. The start of their trek could not have been any better. 1,000 miles south on the coast of India, there were mass evacuations as the country prepared for landfall. 5 days after starting their trek, Stephen and Mike would wake up early in the village of Manang at 11,500 feet, about 2 days away from the highest point of the trek, Thorong La Pass. The night before, Stephen had noticed tiny specks of white falling from the sky, but nothing like the scene he was waking up to. The morning was bright. There was a glare off the 2 feet of snowfall on the ground. The duo was in shock. October in Manang typically means blue skies, not blizzards. It was pretty clear they would not be riding today. Stephen knew that if there was 2 feet of snow at their altitude, higher up on the pass, the route would be impassable. The power and phone lines were out, so Stephen and Mike spent their time reading and watching others pour into the village from below. Some of them would take off for the pass, deciding to brave the conditions and praying for the snow to end. A light snowfall is not uncommon, but this was anything but normal for those who knew the area. Yet scores of hikers continued to leave for the higher pass. Reports of avalanches along the route began making their way down to villages, and the conditions continued to worsen until visibility was nearly non-existent. The heavy snowfall had no end, and the temperature had consistently dropped over the day. There was a full whiteout. Even the most experienced climbers would struggle in these conditions. A climber on the pass would later state, "The ground became the same color as the sky. It was difficult to see which way was up and which way was down. But fortunately, there was a brief respite, and I saw a pole. We picked our way down for 2 hours. Through this maze of poles that sometimes we couldn't see for minutes on end. He thought 10 people were following him to safety. It turned out to be more like 150. Maya Ora, a young climber from Israel, was trekking the circuit with a large group of friends. They left the high camp at 5:30 a.m. on Tuesday, October 14th, in an attempt to reach the top of the pass. The weather was bad, but the guides had told the group it was okay. Over the next 5 hours, they would battle whiteout conditions and heavy snow, only to reach a small tea house. The shack was already packed with frightened trekkers. Almost everyone there was already suffering from early forms of hypothermia. This was when every single person had to make their own decision. Stay cramped within the cold hut, or try to brave the conditions to get to a lower altitude. Porters and guides started asking tourists for money to lead them down the mountain, and many eagerly paid, even some of Maya's friends. The biggest mistake was that many of the climbers within the hut did not have the proper equipment for the conditions. They did not have extra sleeping bags or thicker clothes, causing many to huddle together for warmth. Nobody could have predicted this scenario. After 20 hours of waiting, their bones were frozen. The cold had seeped into every inch of their bodies, and they were losing energy fast. Maya and her 6 friends knew they needed to get down the pass quickly. At 8 a.m. on October 15th, they would leave the hut. As soon as they left the safety of the tea cabin, the blizzard would unleash its force on them. The conditions were still poor, and the group could not see more than a few feet in front of them. But the biggest challenge was the route. They had no idea where they were going. The only marker for them were the bodies. As they walked, they passed the bodies of friends and the guides who had tried to take their money inside. Maya would state, "I don't know how many, 20s of them. They were buried under the snow. It will be difficult to find them. It was horrible, a horror." Over the next few hours, the group struggled along, praying they were headed in the right direction. They finally made it to a lower village that day, where they were rescued by helicopter. They were the lucky ones. On the morning of October 15th, Stephen and Mike awoke to blue skies. The storm seemed to pass as quickly as it had come on. The locals scurried around the village, their faces covered in scowls and desperation. Then they started hearing the news.
Survivors and bodies of some of the victims of one of Nepal's worst ever mountain disasters have been brought to the capital Kathmandu. In the Annapurna range, the search goes on for many still missing after a catastrophic snowstorm brought blizzards and avalanches earlier this week.
At first, it was 9 bodies, but there were reports of over 140 missing. It was chaos. Everyone huddled in nearby towns looking for any news. Family members began posting all over social media. Websites began publishing lists of hikers, their names chased by their status. Some said safe, some deceased, but the majority said unknown. The drone of helicopters in the air became a familiar sound as they scoured the circuit, looking for any signs of missing climbers. That same day, the Nepali government helicopters joined the bright red rescue ones in the air, ferrying the dead and injured. It quickly became the most significant search and rescue effort in the region's history. Foreign volunteer doctors set up stations in the nearby villages, treating hikers who had suffered snow blindness, altitude sickness, and hypothermia. But the rush of climbers never came. Those who were rescued were flown to larger hospitals in the area. As the days passed, the risks began to decrease, and Stephen and Mike set out on the circuit once again. They were the only ones going up the pass besides the few rescue climbers, and as the first climbers made it to the top, they had to be airlifted to the other side as the descent was impassable. As Mike and Stephen made their way up the pass, they met more hikers in retreat. As they passed one another, they pointed down the slopes toward a shape by a river. It was a body. That was when the moment sunk in for Stephen and Mike. They had watched the rescue operations from afar, but seeing the body lying in the frozen landscape made it a reality. They walked over to the body of a man. He was a monk. His head was lying on a red rucksack, a blanket draped over his legs, and one of his hands balled into a fist. A helicopter swooped in and hovered above the group, preparing to remove the body. After they watched the monk lifted away, they trekked in silence. Their perspectives changed. At the high camp, they along with one other man were the only foreigners left in the pass. The snow was waist deep at this point, so they decided to turn around. That was the end of their expedition. As Stephen and Mike watched the events unfold that week, they couldn't help but think, if the cyclone was predicted, why were there no weather reports called in? No radio, no warning systems in place. This is one of the world's most famous and highest hikes, chock full of ill-equipped amateurs. Every climber has to pay a $20 fee to register their trek and help with search and rescue. So shouldn't some of those funds be going towards preventative communication? In all, 518 people were rescued from the region, including 304 foreign hikers. 43 lost their lives. 21 of these deaths were directly on the circuit, while 8 died in an avalanche in a nearby village, and 5 more at the base camp of Annapurna, where the snow had buried their tents. In the span of a week, the Himalayas would have one of the worst storms in its history, and kickstart the largest rescue operation it had ever seen. Experience did not matter. If you did not have shelter, there was no way to survive the elements. In the aftermath, local authorities were criticized for not giving sufficient warning of approaching bad weather to the trekkers and local residents. However, some officials believe that those killed or injured were inexperienced and inadequately equipped. The Prime Minister of Nepal, Sushil Koirala, called the loss of life extremely tragic at a time when worldwide weather updates are available every second, and said that weather warning systems would be improved. The Nepal Tourism Ministry said that the incident has taught us a lesson, and that more emergency shelters and better weather tracking and communication were needed to avert future tragedies. Newly proposed procedures and regulations include a trekker registry, checkpoints, GPS tracking units, and mandatory use of trained local guides. However, regulations at that time required trekkers to check in at various waypoints, and licensed guides were already recommended. There was no system in place place at the time to inform trekkers of weather conditions en route. And that is the real issue.